Hello, I'm Patrick Clausen. I'm the Director of Research here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And first things first, since this is being filmed by C-SPAN, it's particularly important that you turn off your phones. So please either turn them off or at the very least put them on stun. Much ink has been spilled and many words across the airways about the tensions between the United States and Iran. Much of the focus has been on what's the Trump administration planning to do. That's not what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be discussing how does the region look at what the United States is doing and what's the region's thinking about this situation. So we have assembled three excellent people to address the question about how does the region look at Iran-U.S. relationships. And we're going to start with our very own Mike Eisenstadt, who's the Kahn Fellow and the director of our Military and Security Studies program, who as active duty military officer served at CENTCOM and has had a lot of other service with the U.S. government in the region. And he is going to walk us through some of the background to how does the region look at this kind of confrontation. Then we're going to turn to John Miller, who is a retired vice admiral, who was recently the commander of the U.S. Forces, U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and the head of the U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, or NAVCENT. And he's now the president of the Fozzie Miller Group, and he's an associate fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Then we'll conclude with Ambassador Barbara Leaf, who formerly served as the U.S. ambassador in the United Arab Emirates, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq, and Director of the Office of Iranian Affairs at the State Department, and is now a senior fellow here at the Washington Institute. So with that, let me turn the podium over to Mike Eisenstadt.
Thank you, Patrick. And let me just say what an honor it is to be on this panel with Vice Admiral Miller and Ambassador Leaf and with Patrick. What I thought I would do is try to provide some comments to frame our discussion today by providing my understanding of how Iran looks at the United States, the tensions and conflict with the U.S. and recent U.S. moves, because I think it's critical to understanding, issues that are being discussed today publicly in the United States, such as the prospects for war and the next U.S. move and likely next Iranian moves. So first, let me just start off with my understanding, my perception of Iran's image of the United States and their threat perception of the United States. You can understand their fundamental image by looking at what they say, especially the statements of the Supreme Leader, which are very detailed. He speaks almost every few days on this topic. The issue of threat perceptions, however, is more difficult to discern. And I would argue that actually what senior officers and officials say does not actually always conform to, I think, their actual perceptions on this issue. So, and let me just say, I don't assume also that perceptions of these matters are monolithic in the Iranian system. I think there are differences there as there are differences here on these issues. Now, first of all, with regard to their fundamental perception of the United States, and on this I think there is generally broader agreement within the system, let's say, people within the regime, senior officers, senior civilian officials, that the United States is a dangerous, implacable foe that has done great harm to the Iranian nation and that has demonstrated that it's completely untrustworthy. And I'll give you three kind of data points or examples for this. First of all, the Iran-Iraq War, which still is an event that the wounds from the war are still raw in Iran, and is still something which really influences politics and popular discussions there, as well as the thinking of the military, because many of the veterans in senior command positions today fought in the Iran-Iraq War. First of all, they blamed the United States for giving Iraq a green light to invade Iran, even though there's actually now good scholarship on this side of the ocean which shows that there was no such green light. In fact, we gave the Iranians intelligence showing that the U.S. was planning to invade, that Iraq was planning to invade Iran. Thank you. They blame us for the arms embargo, which constrained the war effort, and for providing chemical weapons to Iraq. I will say that the precursors for some of the chemical weapons did come from the United States at a time that our export controls were not very well developed. They blame us for silence on Iraq's chemical weapon use, and they blame us for the Airbus shoot-down in July of 1988, which was the final straw which led them to decide to accept the ceasefire. But for them, this was an intentional act and proof that the United States will stop at nothing to harm Iran. They also then perceive that we are engaged in unceasing software efforts to overthrow the regime in Iran, and they point to what they call the sedition or fitna of 2009 as an example of this, the Green Movement, as an attempt by the United States to foment a color revolution in Iran. And often many Iranian officials, both military and civilian, say that this kind of domestic sedition is even more dangerous than the external threat that the United States poses. And I would argue that by and large, I think that is probably how they see it. But of course, the external threat waxes and wanes, and there have been times when the threat of U.S. military force became kind of foremost in their minds in terms of their concerns. And then what they see as the bad faith implementation and then withdrawal from the nuclear deal with Iran. I'll just say that their blame extends also to the Obama administration, which they feel was kind of foot-dragging on its obligations under the JCPOA. So this is not necessarily just a Trump administration thing. This goes back to the Obama administration. And the Supreme Leader says repeatedly that I had my doubts about this. I really had strong reservations on this, and I told you so. They were going to renege on this agreement. And if you look at their narrative, they also say that despite all these efforts by the United States over 40 years to undermine the Islamic Republic, they have repeatedly thwarted American goals. First, the United States sought the overthrow of the Islamic Republic by supporting the Iraqi invasion of 1980, and that failed, excuse me. When that failed, the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11 to pave the way for an invasion of Iran. But then when the U.S. got mired in insurgency operations in those countries, those efforts to kind of head on to Tehran after Baghdad and Kabul were thwarted. The U.S. then sought to undermine the Islamic Republic by soft warfare. I mentioned the 2009 sedition. That failed. The U.S. then tried to destroy the axis of resistance, that is, Iran and its allies, Syria, Hezbollah, by fomenting a civil war in Syria with the Saudis and the Israelis. And that also failed, thanks in large part to the actions of Iran and its allies. And as a result of the failure of all these hard and soft warfare efforts, the U.S. is now trying to undermine Iran through economic warfare, through sanctions. And that's the phase that we're in right now. Okay. Now, in terms of the threat perceptions, in their public statements, Iranian officials often project confidence in their ability to deal with the military threat posed by the U.S., but express greater concern about alleged U.S. soft warfare and economic warfare efforts. And if you look at the Supreme Leader's Nowruz speech in March of this year, this theme comes through very clearly. But I'm not really sure that actually 100% accurately reflects their perceptions. If you look at how Iran responded to U.S. actions in Syria in 2017 and 2018, at first it looked like the Iranians were, as they do as they've done with other presidents, were trying to test the U.S. in Syria. We had several tests around Tanf where we had the U.S. and the British have special forces in order to see if they could move on the small garrison at Tanf and threaten it. Those were met by a tough response by the United States, attacks on convoys. These were proxies. These were, I think, Iraqi proxy groups that were involved. And the shoot-down of 2 attack drones that were sent against Tanf. There was also the pushback against the Wagner Group guys in Deir ez-Zor, which had nothing to do with Iran, but was seen as a message of how hard the U.S. was willing to push, if pushed. And then you had the 2 U.S. strikes in response to Syrian use of chemical weapons. These were very limited strikes, but again, I think this gave Iran pause, and it kind of backed off and decided to not test the Trump administration anymore, at least for the time being. And I think they changed their focus to pushing back against the United States by threatening America's regional allies, that is Israel and Saudi Arabia. So we saw kind of a growing Iranian activities in Syria in 2017, 2018 to build up Iran's position there. This elicited an unexpectedly tough pushback from Israel. And I think so the Iranians were also surprised by the resolve that the Israelis showed. And as a result, I think they also then took a step back there, decided to put greater efforts on Iraq and Lebanon, and to operate in Syria in a different kind of way that would be less vulnerable to targeting by the Israelis. So their main focus then was on the Saudis, and I think a lot of the activities in this area were probably in the cyber arena. Okay? So I think there was this kind of Trump effect, if you will, in 2017 and 2018. But then you have President Trump's announcement of his decision in December of 2018 to withdraw from Syria. And then the subsequent rollback of that decision, it seems. So, what's an Ayatollah to think? With these kind of mixed messages that the United States is sending that it wants to leave the region, all there is death and desert, and yet we're not leaving so quickly after all. At the same time, the U.S. starts doubling down on its maximum pressure campaign by April 22nd of this year, announcing its halt to waivers on oil sales as part of its efforts to cut Iranian oil exports to zero. And that puts Iran on the horns of a dilemma in terms of how to respond to that, because people had speculated until then they were planning to or hoping to maybe outweight the Trump administration. But then if oil exports are going to be cut down dramatically, maybe they can't wait out the Trump administration anymore. Maybe the decrease in oil exports is going to exacerbate domestic unrest and have perhaps feed into American efforts to kind of conduct soft warfare against the regime. So that played into their concerns about soft warfare as well. And then there's also, on the one hand, even though the President Trump is sending indications time and again that he wants to get out of the region, we've seen other presidents in the past flip-flop. In 90, during tensions between Iraq and Kuwait, we said we don't have an opinion on these matters. Iraq invades Kuwait, and we lead an international coalition against Iraq. President Bush says no nation. George W. Bush, running for president, says I'm not going to do nation and state building. 9/11 happens. We engage in our biggest nation and state building effort since World War II. And then President Obama says no third Middle Eastern war. Mosul falls, and he finds himself in a third Middle Eastern war. So we're very unpredictable from their point of view, and this is, from their point of view, also very unsettling. So let me just talk a few things about their way of war by way of getting ready to wrap up. Iran, and this feeds into the discussion about Iran's preferred modus operandi and all the talk about a major war that's going to be worse than the war with Iraq. Iran's way of war is to avoid or deter major conventional conflicts, if at all possible, while advancing its anti-status quo agenda via shaping activities, which consist mainly of proxy operations and information activities. This is in part a lesson of the Iran-Iraq war, and watching two U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. They have learned from their own experience and watching the experience of the United States that major conventional conflicts are often costly and protracted, and much easier to start than they are to stop. So Iran wants to avoid, if at all possible, a repeat of that traumatic experience of the Iran-Iraq war. And that, in part, explains their reliance on proxies. Also, since Iran is an anti-status quo power, they know that their efforts to alter the regional balance of power will bring them into friction with the U.S. and other powers. Therefore, the best way to manage conflict and to limit the potential for escalation is to rely on proxies, to test and probe rather than to decisively engage or commit themselves against an adversary, which enables them to better assess and calibrate risk, to be tactically flexible. They'll back off after making threats. And there are many examples when Iranian officials have made threats and then have backed off after their bluff was called. Which is something to keep in mind. And then they'll try wedge strategies in trying to divide their enemies, whether it's trying to divide the current administration or trying to divide the United States from the EU. Their experience has also showed that 30 years of interaction with the U.S. has taught them that they could wage proxy warfare against the U.S. without risking a military response or paying an unacceptable cost. So again, there are many examples: Marine barracks bombings, Khobar Towers, Iraq during the U.S. occupation, the Arbab CR affair in 2011 here when they were plotting to kill the Saudi ambassador, and then there are probes in Syria in 2017 that I discussed a moment ago. Now, with regard to what's going on in the naval arena, and I'm going to be wrapping up, I know time is getting short, so keep in mind Operation Earnest Will in the late part of the Iran-Iraq war between July 1987 and the end of the war about a year later, where the U.S. organized naval convoys to protect reflagged ships. Deterrence failed during the first convoy, where the freighter Bridgeton hit a mine. We thought that the presence of U.S. aircraft carrier there would deter Iran, they wouldn't try anything, and we were proven wrong. But due to the limited damage inflicted and the lack of casualties caused by the use of that mine, the U.S. opted not to respond in order to forestall escalation, thereby paving the way to further escalation. So for the next year, we were involved in a series of actions trying to limit Iran's freedom of action. They were trying to find ways. They stopped for a while attacks. They stopped surface attacks on reflagged ships. They relied heavily on mines, and they started ramping up the attacks again. They attacked a tanker in Kuwaiti waters that was formerly in part of a convoy using Silkworm missiles that were captured from the Iraqis, and they launched from occupied areas of the Fao Peninsula to create ambiguity. So they were very good at this. The bottom line is, in the end, we were able to limit Iran's ability to expand the conflict economically, and to prevent the operations at sea from getting any worse. But in the end, it was the shoot down of the Airbus plane, which was an accident, which finally caused Iran to end the war. So let me just say, and these will be my final comments with regard to the prospect for escalation. And a lot of people are talking about the potential for inadvertent escalation. First of all, as I mentioned before, several hundred Americans in the high hundreds, maybe approaching 1,000, have been killed as a result of Iranian action in the past 40 years, through proxy action for the most part, and we've never gone to war. And in the past 2 years, Israel has killed perhaps 100 or 150 Rev Guard personnel in operations in Syria, and there was not a war, okay? Now, might current conditions be different due to maximum pressure? And this is where I think things might be different, because if you push the Iranians to the wall by cutting their oil exports to a few 100,000 barrels a day, they have to decide either that they fold and they decide to negotiate, or they escalate and they hit back in the hope that the president who doesn't want to fight a war in the Middle East will maybe respond in a kind of symbolic way and then say, you know what, I'm done with this region. I don't want a war, and I'm leaving. So that creates the situation where at least some people in the system might argue this president doesn't have the stomach for the war. We need to test him. We need to do a Marine barracks bombing type of operation where the United States will leave. Now, I'm not saying that these people will prevail, but this is, I think, has a potential. This situation has the potential for creating that kind of dynamic, okay? And with Iran, there's always been a tension between their generally cautious behavior and their tendency to occasionally overreach. And that is something I think the main concern I have, not that it'll be, it won't be an accidental war, so to speak, but it'll be that they misgauge our resolve, or maybe they'll actually be proven right. I don't know. But they might be tempted to test that proposition. So I will leave it at that and just say, if you were to ask me from the point of view, Iran's point of view, tell me how this ends, I'm not sure they know. And I'm not sure in Washington, from our side, we have an answer to that question, but I hope to hear from my colleagues some more on this. So anyhow, thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion after.
Thank you. Admiral Miller, please.
Well, Mike, thanks for clearing all that up. I appreciate that, and thanks to the Institute for the invitation and the opportunity. I'm going to try to stay in my lane as a maritime commander, but what I want to begin with is making sure everybody understands that I think at the end of the day, Iran is a bad actor in the region. And they've been a bad actor in the region since the revolution. And the activities that they are currently involved in today in Yemen and in Syria and Lebanon, and to a lesser extent in Bahrain, the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, are proof that they're bad actors in the region. And so the general policy of maximum pressure that the current administration has a certain amount of merit to it. I would also like to add that if you're going to have that sort of a policy, then that policy ought to have sort of an end game to it, and we ought to have a pretty good understanding of what we would like the Iranians to do, and how we would like them to change, and we would provide them with an avenue and an opportunity to actually change their behavior. And I'm not entirely certain that we've quite done that. So that's a little bit out of my lane, but I thought I'd get that off my chest right at the beginning. Tensions are pretty high right now between the United States and Iran, but we've had periods of high tensions before, and generally speaking, we've managed them pretty well. And we've been able to manage them, as Mike talked about a little bit, without, generally speaking, engaging in conflict. And that's something that should assure most of us, or reassure most of us, as we go through this particular period of high tension. What ought to concern us a little bit is while we've never had or seldom have had opportunities to have very good communications with the Iranians, we're at a period of time, I think, that we have particularly poor communications with the Iranian government. And so the opportunity from either a diplomatic or from a military standpoint, which is where I view this, to communicate with the Iranians is especially poor. And so the opportunity for a miscalculation, a misunderstanding to become something much greater than it should be is probably higher now than it has been in the past. And so it ought to be a matter of some concern to all of us. Part of what we ought to understand is, Iran has been a country that has been under sanctions of one level or another since the revolution, either directly from the United States or in a more concerted fashion from the United Nations for most of the time since the revolution in 1979. Yet despite that, they've been able to continue to increase their military capability and their military capacity. And so it's a rather extraordinary achievement. So in my early days, I was a F-14 Tomcat radar intercept officer. The only nation we exported F-14s to was Iran. F-14 is a very complicated airplane, and when I was responsible for flying it and maintaining it, we found it to be a very difficult airplane to fly and maintain. In fact, more than a decade ago, the United States retired that airplane because it was so expensive and difficult to maintain. Iran still flies that airplane, and so what that tells us is that they're pretty good at maintaining things, at being innovative, at being thoughtful about how to make things work, how to keep things working, and so today, if you want to find a flying, working, combat-capable F-14 in the world, you have to go to Iran. You can't find one here. And if you want to find very capable unmanned aerial vehicles, or you want to find capable unmanned surface vehicles, you can go to Iran and you can find them flying in the Gulf every day. You can find them flying or sailing in the Gulf. You can find them flying or sailing in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait off the coast of Yemen, because that's where the Iranians are in fact operating or helping the Houthis operate. And so they're out and about in ways that ought to inform us and impress us in terms of their willingness and their ability to be part of the region and to be a significant and an influential part of the region. And so we should be aware of that, and we should be mindful of that, and we should not be dismissive of the capabilities or the intelligence or the effort that they bring to the fight, if you will, every single day. And so when we look at how we ought to deal with the Iranians and how we ought to view the Iranian capability, we need to understand that it's a significant capability, despite the fact that for 40 years, for the entire time since the revolution, despite all of the sanctions, they still continue to flourish, they still continue to develop, they still continue to increase their capability. And so they're not an insignificant threat. And so how we deal with them is something that we need to be much more mindful of. And so simply levying more sanctions on them, simply trying to tell them that they can't do this or they can't do that, is probably not the most successful way to deal with them. And if we want to deal with them in the future, we're going to have to deal with them in a more comprehensive, I think, way than we dealt with them in the past. What concerns me and what concerned me when I was a maritime commander was the fact that we didn't have, and we historically have not had, good diplomatic ways to deal with the Iranians, but we also didn't have ways to deal with the Iranians from a military standpoint. So if you go back to the Cold War days, when we were dealing with the Soviets, we developed ways so that we could talk commander to commander. We developed hotlines, if you will. Eventually, we decided we needed to have a hotline with the Iranians, and so we proposed that. It was proposed, I think, by Admiral Mullen in 2011, and the Iranians appeared to not be interested in having a hotline, but we developed one. We established a hotline. We had one when I was the commander, starting in 2012. But the Iranians never used it, and they never called us. And so in the time between 2012 and 2015, they never called us. And when we called them, because we would exercise it every single day, they would never call us back, and they weren't interested in it. So they weren't interested in having a hotline or some sort of a communication capability where we could diffuse tensions. And so the ability for me as a maritime commander or for any maritime commander to diffuse tensions with the Iranians didn't exist while I was there, and I don't believe exists today. What that really means and what that is important, why that's important, is because I think at the end of the day you can have a tactical action that takes place that has a strategic result. So part of what or how that manifests itself is the Iranians maintain the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in particular maintains a force in the Strait of Hormuz every single day. And it's the only maritime strait in the world that is guarded, if you will, by a military force. So every ship, whether it's a civilian merchant ship that's transiting through the Gulf, or it's a warship that's transiting through the Gulf, goes by Iranian Revolutionary Guard warships. Sometimes those Iranian Revolutionary Guard warships will make approaches to either U.S. Navy or other military warships that are in ways that would seem to be aggressive. And so the military commanders have to decide, is this an attack on my ship, or is it hostile intent, or is it just an aggressive approach? And so if that were to take place during a period like we have today of increased and heightened tensions, and somebody shoots when they perhaps shouldn't shoot, or they shoot when perhaps they should, you end up with a tactical situation that has strategic consequences, and all of a sudden we're in a shooting war with the Iranians when we don't necessarily need to be in a shooting war with the Iranians. That's an unfortunate event. And then subsequent to that event, there's not a method, there's not a way, commander to commander out in the region, to be able to discuss that event and to understand what happened, why it happened, how do we de-escalate that event, and how do we move forward without subsequent shooting events, without a subsequent escalation of activities. The last thing I'd like to talk about, we are at a time, as I mentioned at the beginning, that this is not the worst of times with us and the Iranians. It's not the best of times either. We have deployed a carrier strike group to the region, but for most of the last decade, we've normally had a carrier strike group deployed to the region. We deployed some B-52s to the region, but we can deploy B-1s, B-2s, B-52s to Iran tomorrow. So what we've shown is that we are interested in the Iranian activity, or the alleged Iranian activity in Fujairah, the admitted Houthi activity on the Saudi pipeline, and so we have deterred. We continue to deter what we consider to be some aggressive Iranian activity, or at least alleged Iranian activity. So there's this sort of tit-for-tat activity that's going on now. So there is an opportunity here for us to move forward. And as military commanders, I can assure you that on the U.S. side, from the chairman down to the sailor, to the Coast Guardsmen, to the airmen that are manning the gun mount, that they are talking about how to avoid a miscalculation. I can assure you that the same is true on the Iranian side. And so that concerns me, and it should be a matter of concern for all of us. But that's how we're going to have to move forward, is to make sure that we provide a path between the United States and Iran to move forward on this particular situation, so that we can move ahead, and so that we can defuse and we can de-escalate this particular situation. Thank you very much.
And now, Ambassador Leaf.
Good afternoon. You know, I'd like to start following on these two excellent sets of discussions. I'd like to start with something that's really not, it may sound slightly theoretical, but it's not really, so bear with me. And I want to start with a bit of a discussion about deterrence, because I think it becomes it has always been quite important in our non-relationship with Iran. I like to look at it these days in some contrast to what I think was a pretty effective set of deterrence activities over decades, during the Cold War, when we had an enormous adversary in the Soviet Union with catastrophic potential to destroy us, and a very lively, vivid proxy game contest all over the world going on for decades. And of course, as everyone knows, one of the points at which we came closest, or the point that we came closest to actual conflict, was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the aftermath of that crisis, when there was, the essential question was, what was the intent? And intent is really the key piece of this in deterrence strategy. In the aftermath, President John F. Kennedy directed that a special hotline be set up between the President of the United States and the head of state of the Soviet Union so that they could bypass what was very cumbersome communications technology at the time and, when need be, pick up the phone and talk directly or almost directly. But that was an enhancement of what was then already a fairly robust set of communication tools between the two countries. And that stands also in contrast to where we are with Iran today. So just to remind, deterrence against an adversary to be effective requires a set of key ingredients. Understanding of the adversary's intent, clear strategic messaging of one's own intentions regarding vital interests, and transgression against which could trigger lethal force. And that coupled with a calibrated display of force as potential response to any such transgressions as needed. Effective deterrence permits escalation dominance short of resort to force, and it reduces the risk of accidental conflict in a period of mounting tensions. Now, as I mentioned a moment earlier, direct communication between leaders at or on the march to full-blown crisis can offer further needed communication channels for communication of intent and a possible off-ramp. And I would just say that we had, in the days of the Cold War, of course, we had fully manned diplomatic missions in each other's capitals and consulates and so forth, and we had a variety of other communication tools. In other words, from 1933 on, throughout the worst days of the Cold War, we always had a set of conventional and elaborate communication channels. So let me put the theory to the test in the context of where we are with Iran today. Does the administration understand Tehran's intentions currently? No. But that's the norm more often than not, as I think you heard both of our speakers say. It's the nature of Iran's approach to conflict with the U.S., asymmetrical, gray zone use of proxies. It's the opaque nature of the regime and regime decision-making that renders analysis of intentions extraordinarily complex for analysts and for policymakers under the best of circumstances. We're now in a state of greatly heightened tensions against the backdrop of a year-long economic war against Iran from Tehran's perspective. We have virtually no direct communications with Tehran. We have what we call the Swiss channel, which is the Swiss embassy acting on behalf of the United States. But we've not had a diplomatic mission in Iran for 40 years. And those other channels, Swiss channel being the formal one, and occasionally other would-be intermediaries from the region and elsewhere, are very, very limited. So thus, unlike the situation with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, virtually all of our messaging, all of our strategic messaging is in the public domain or via shows of military force and occasionally covert action. Tehran's response to U.S. abrogation of the JCPOA and launching of a maximum pressure campaign has been bitter in rhetoric and focused on cleaving off Europe from the U.S., isolating the U.S., looking for backdoor relief from the pressure of U.S. sanctions. So the question of how precisely to interpret certain recent intelligence threat streams suggesting Iranian intent to target U.S. facilities in the Gulf, commercial shipping, U.S. personnel in Iraq, use of their proxies to do so, rests on divining the Iranian leadership's intent. Is it Tehran posturing defensively against an expected U.S. military move, or does the intelligence indicate an effort to strike back, to displace some of this pressure? And this is what led, of course, to the administration deploying and accelerating the deployment of certain military assets. Number two, has the administration clearly conveyed its own intentions to its adversary? No. Let me start with the May 5th warning by the National Security Advisor that, quote, any attack on the United States interests or on those of our allies will be met with unrelenting force. Now that is so expansive a definition of U.S. vital interests as to almost be meaningless. And therefore the threat of use of force applied to defend those interests becomes questionable. It could even become non-credible. A series of other things leads to, I think, some faulty deterrence messaging. A failure to brief the Congress in a timely fashion. Now, that has occurred in this past week, but in the first week of this mounting crisis, that lack of consultation produced a very predictable chorus of skepticism that distracts from deterrence, because you want unity of message and you want unity of government. Here's another piece, which I think in a steady state situation between Iran and the U.S. Is a certain failure, but right now is particularly concerning. No regular press briefings, and I'm saying no daily press briefings, no weekly briefings by Department of Defense, State, National Security Council, or the White House. You have episodic interviews by the Secretary of State. You have tweeting by the President. But in a setting of escalating threats and a mounting U.S. response to those threats, the lack of almost any regular briefing of the press borders on reckless. And it certainly undercuts our ability to craft a robust, compelling message of deterrence to Tehran. Now, the one thing I would say the administration got absolutely right was Secretary Pompeo going to Baghdad on May 7th, carrying a very clear message to the Iraqi government about that other set of threats that we weren't really talking about a moment ago, and that's threats against U.S. personnel, U.S. facilities in Iraq by Iranian proxies, Iraqi militias. Pompeo laid those concerns out, and he properly put responsibility on the Iraqi government to make sure that they were doing their part. And it's also, by the way, another way to pass a message to Iran, and I'm confident that was done. But I would say the most concerning issue right now for me is that the administration has sent very confused and confusing messages, confusing to the Iranians. And the Iranians have been talking openly about this at the leadership level. Again, that lack of consistency of message undercuts deterrence and even draws a question mark over the intelligence itself. The president began speaking fairly early on of his desire for personal direct contact with Tehran, almost from the outset, saying what Iran should be doing is calling me up on May 9th. And then a few days later saying he hoped not only that the two countries would not go to war, but he was sure, quote, Iran will want to talk soon. He met on the 16th in a meeting that was flagged by the White House as an opportunity he met with the Swiss president, the Swiss Confederation president, in a meeting that was flagged as an opportunity to discuss, quote, Switzerland's role in facilitating international diplomacy, code word for the Swiss Channel, direct contact with Iran. And then on May 20th, we have no indication that anything's happened or will happen, but if it does, it will be met obviously with great force. I think Iran would be making a very big mistake if they did anything. If they do something, it will be met with great force, but we have no indication that they will. This undercuts the deployment of forces, the reason for doing so, and it also, by the way, undercut the logic of the May 15th announcement of a substantial evacuation of U.S. diplomatic personnel from the embassy in Baghdad and Erbil. Then you have a May 15th Pompeo phone call with the Omani foreign minister, who promptly went to Tehran. And in the middle of all of this, you have what I consider to be Tehran's response. And yes, I know we don't have the official investigation results, but you've got the May 12th attacks off Fujairah against 4 tankers. You have the May 14th drone attacks on the Saudi East-West pipeline. You have the May 15th Katyusha rocket fired at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Same day, Trump, if Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Now, to the issue of risk of conflict, I too would say that there's a lot of room for misapprehension by the Iranian leadership. I think for all of this confused messaging on the administration's part, there's a certain steadiness and method behind the moves that are underway, exactly as Vice Admiral Miller said. But as Mike said, the Iranian leadership has viewed itself at war with Washington for at least a year, if not longer, but certainly under the maximum pressure campaign. There's a consistent reiteration of non-intent or non-desire to move to armed conflict, whether by the supreme leader or other civilian or military leaders in Iran. But there is a risk of Iran overplaying its hand and reckoning that there are no real red lines for U.S. military action. And there's a strong Iranian motivation to paint the U.S. as the instigator of escalation. And that would be a continuation of what Iran has been doing in the past year, which is portraying the U.S. as isolated, the U.S. as the outlaw because of the withdrawal from the JCPOA. Messaging U.S. allies, close allies, that they will pay a price for U.S. policies. Demonstrate that the Trump administration is all bark, no bite. And not unimportantly, and this gets to the issue of where they think this is all going, generate a rally around the flag dynamic internally, especially given the economic pressures which are unrelenting and the lack of clear options for them to relieve those pressures. So, given the cacophony of noise in Washington and Europe, Iranian leaders may be calculating that the U.S. Goliath is hemmed in by its own domestic politics, congressional divisions, public antipathy to another Middle Eastern war, lack of U.S. allies. Europe has been vocal in questioning the U.S. threat posture and even the intelligence. And most importantly, the president's own clearly telegraphed, long-standing reluctance to get dragged into foreign wars. And we saw that burst into view in Syria with a decision to bring prematurely declare the end of the ISIS fight over and all troops coming out of Syria. And that bubbled up again even over Venezuela. So with no smoking gun evidence regarding the perpetrators of all three of the attacks, well, the Houthis declared themselves responsible, but for the Katyusha and for the Fajera attacks, no smoking gun. No U.S. response to those attacks, despite that May 5th statement. Attacks on U.S. or its allies and their interests. Public scrutiny of the attacks has been superseded by congressional and European second-guessing of U.S. intelligence and speculation about U.S. intentions, not Iran. Now, a word about Iraq, and then I'll say a word about the Gulf, because both of these are sets of close partners, would-be partners. And they pose really different challenges for us. And I think the Iranians are quite savvy to those. Iraq presents a particularly sensitive landscape for the U.S., and it lends itself least to use or threat of use of direct military force by the U.S. either as deterrence or response. And Qasem Soleimani knows this well. So it's, in my view, the most likely setting to which Tehran will again return to test the administration. Several dozen Iraqi militias formed, trained, resourced by Iran, enjoying considerable degrees of operational independence and resistance to Iraqi government control. The administration really needs to rethink how it responds to what is likely to be periodically elevated threats against U.S. personnel or facilities. The Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, present a huge array of vulnerable and very tempting targets. But I do think, for the time being, that the buildup of a U.S. naval presence, especially in the Arabian Sea, should have a quenching effect. But the message has been received and understood in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh in any case. Alternative energy export routes that avoid the Strait of Hormuz are vulnerable nonetheless. And I think you can see from the reactions, the public reactions in the Gulf have been very muted. There have been a few editorials in Saudi Arabia calling for surgical strikes, etc., but by and large, the governments are being very cautious. And the Saudis have called an emergency summit 2.5 weeks after the attacks. And the UAE has been quite careful not to stipulate who it thinks is behind the attacks. So I think the Gulf vulnerabilities, the corrosive effect of the 2017 split within the GCC have rendered the GCC largely mute and largely passive in the face of a clear threat by Tehran to use the Gulf as a testing, probing point for U.S. security guarantees. And with that, I will end here.
Thank you. I would be interested in any of your reactions about the question of to what extent Iran's actions are the actions of isolated individual elements, so-called rogues or hot dogs, and to what extent do you think that Tehran maintains a rather careful control over these kinds of proxies and kind of ambiguous attacks, kind of difficult to attribute attacks that Barbara was talking about?
I would speak to Iraq if you like, Patrick. I think Iraq is the most problematic place to find that attribution. And in fact, you've seen several prominent militia leaders disavow responsibility and also essentially in their own odd way call for calm, that Iraq doesn't want to be in the middle of a shooting war. So I think it's the hardest place for us to divine what's going on.
Yeah, I'll just two points on that. First, starting with Iraq, one thing that's kind of impressive when you look back at the American return to Iraq after 2014, after the fall of Mosul, that our return to Iraq kind of crossed a number of red lines for a number of these pro-Iran groups that said, you come back, you guys will be targets, and resistance against occupation will resume. And because it was in Iran's interests and probably their interests not to hit us, they didn't. So, now, of course, that may have changed by now. I don't know. But it's impressive the degree to which I think it's fair to say Iran was probably able to enforce discipline over its proxies since 2014. There is an example, though, if you look back, the start of the Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006, where Hezbollah, in pursuit of its own interests, in order to kind of seize Israeli soldiers in order to arrange a swap for prisoners that were being held by Israel, stumbled into a war, and this is one of the kind of foremost examples of accidental war, or war through miscalculation in the region, and they stumbled into a war that Iran was very upset about them for, and imposed greater controls over Hezbollah afterwards. So I think as a result of that experience, Iran has learned some lessons about how to deal with its proxies and ensure that they, respond and don't drag them or drag themselves into a conflict that harms Iran's interests. But you could never, again, it's an outlier type of an event, but it remains possible.
Yeah, I'll talk to the IRGC. One of the things that we used to try to deal with was when you saw misbehavior, in particular in the maritime environment or over the Gulf in the airways by Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces, was that an individual commander or was that a regional commander or was that something bigger? And trying to decide where did that really come from. And I think what we've learned over the fullness of time here, in particular because we haven't seen any sort of misbehavior out of the Rev Guard in almost 2 years, is that it really is behavior that is directed right from Tehran. And if it doesn't come directly from the supreme leader, it comes from somebody like Soleimani or at a very high level. So, I'm not to speak to proxies. That's a little bit more complicated and difficult. But if you're talking about Revolutionary Guard, I think their activities are very closely directed by Tehran.
Thank you. Well, now it's time for you to direct our activities by coming up with some questions to ask our panel. Since this is being broadcast, please do wait until you get a microphone, and when you start out by telling us who you are, and please ask a question. So do I see any questions here? Right in front of you.
Stanley Colbert, there's a saying attributed to Napoleon. You can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. Lots of bayonets in the Middle East. Lots of missiles that the Iranians have put in the region. And the missiles are now being used. I'm looking at an article by former Pakistani chief of staff Aslam Beg, and he says, if Israel decides to engage Iran, the estimated number of over 200,000 missiles and free flight rockets would be raining over Israel from 3 directions.
Could we get a question, please?
And so that's the question. Has Iran put 200,000 missiles in there for deterrence or to use them?
Okay.
I'm looking at
Well,
I'm
I would
looking
say-
particularly at Mike.
To use them for deterrence purposes, I guess I would say. I mean, one of the reasons why the Iranians were very upset with Hezbollah in 2006 is that one aspect of the Israeli campaign that was very effective and successful was the Israeli Air Force strikes against the long-range rockets that Hezbollah had at that point, the Zilzal and kind of similar models, that Iran saw as critical to its own deterrent capability. So Hezbollah, in pursuing its own interests, in a certain way, kind of jeopardized Iranian deterrence by taking steps that ensured that this trump card would be taken from Iran's hand. I'll just say, look, the Israelis have already conducted hundreds of strikes against Iranian positions in Syria during 2017 and 2018. And like I said, they've killed probably 100, 150, and there's not been a war. So, and the thing is, Hezbollah, this is where it kind of gets a little bit fraught for the Iranians or for Hezbollah, because in a way, Hezbollah has become too important for Iran to lose in pursuing kind of side kind of engagements. You need Hezbollah in the event that there's a direct American attack on Iran in order to either retaliate or to deter such a strike. And therefore, you don't want to squander those capabilities for, to achieve marginal gains in secondary theaters when the homeland could potentially be threatened. So I think it's actually much more complicated. I disagree respectively with the Pakistani chief of staff that we've already seen that scenario come to pass, and it hasn't resulted in 150,000 rockets raining down on Israel, simply because it's much more complicated than that.
If I can add to that, and I agree largely with what Mike just said, but so let's say there's something like 100 or 125,000 missiles or rockets that Hezbollah has. I think the real concern that the Israelis have is that these become not just rockets, but that they become guided missiles, and then in some way have some real potency to them. The concern we ought to have is the fact that what we do have are indications that the Iranians are trying to provide, and a lot of these are Syrian-provided weapons, by the way, I think, at least what we saw back in 2006. So what we ought to be really concerned about is that these become precision-guided weapons. And what we're seeing is an effort by the Iranians to provide that precision guidance. And so that is an issue that we ought to be concerned about. We ought to be dedicated to stopping this particular proliferation. The other sort of unasked question here, but something that we ought to be aware of, is part of our administration's concern about the JCPOA was that it didn't include Iranian ballistic missiles, and what the Iranians do in their own defense, and we ought to take that in the fullness of that question. So if you go back to the Iran-Iraq War, the War of the Cities, the exchange of ballistic missiles, that's a valid discussion that we ought to engage the Iranians in, and how they choose to defend their nation. So it's not simply a matter of saying you can't have them or you shouldn't have them, but what do you have them for? How are we going to negotiate what that looks like in terms of what that means to the entire region and what it means to regional stability and security. And so it needs to be a more fulsome debate, because we didn't have that debate during the JCPOA, and we should have.
Thank you. In back, 2 gentlemen.
This is on.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes,
Yeah.
Steve Sherman. My question is that we're hearing the same criticism of Trump administration's bellicose rhetoric and his mixed messages as we did when he, if you will, faced off against North Korea. He did get sanctions, the UN, to come to help bring North Koreans to the negotiating table. The Trump administration's sanctions now are showing results in cutting off financial assistance to Hezbollah and Hamas. It seems that also the Europeans are beginning to come around. Turkey has announced it's not going to buy any more oil. I think the Netherlands have ceased buying oil. Is the foreign policy establishment got it all wrong again? It seems to be working.
So, I mean, well, it depends on what you mean by got it all wrong. So there's a maximum campaign of maximum pressure, economic in nature, which is driving Iran and Iranian leaders to a point where potentially, and this is the issue of that a lot of people are trying to analyze these days. You know, is that that effort to get a change in behavior going to have the desired results? Will the behavior change? Yes, you see Hezbollah funding drying up. You don't see much effect on other activities in Yemen or Iraq or Syria. So how elastic is the administration's time frame? And then when you get into the current phase that we're in, it becomes extremely difficult to parse out, again, the intent of the Iranians. Do they feel their backs are up against the wall and this is lashing out? Do they see the administration turning to military pressure, having finished with economic pressure? That's not the way I read it, but we're trying to understand what the Iranians are reading and how they are responding. I think the way I look at it right now is they have a lot of cards to play with in that gray zone, in the asymmetrical zone, that don't lend themselves to quick solutions in terms of economic pressure. So I'm not taking issue with a campaign of economic pressure, but I think at a certain point in this escalation that we have ongoing, the risk for miscalculation is there. The concerns I have are about what the U.S. is signaling to the Iranians and what they understand those signals to be. And the president is continuing to say, I'd like to talk to Iranian leaders, but I don't think we have anything like the same dynamic in Tehran that you have in Pyongyang.
If I may interject, I think it's important that those of us in the think tank community have a certain humility and understanding of how we can influence policy. And it's fair to say that there were no experts in North Korea who thought that the policy of maximum pressure would produce a suspension of missile tests, a suspension of nuclear tests, a resumption of negotiations about the nuclear program, and toning down of calls for U.S. troops to end the Korean Peninsula, and the release of Americans. It produced all those results. And it's not surprising that a fair number of people, important people, probably including the president, are not persuaded that regional experts necessarily are getting it right about what the maximum pressure on Iran will produce. I don't think that it would be easy to persuade the president that maximum pressure will have less than the intended results on Iran. Another comment. After the administration announced that the deployment of additional military assets to the region, there were a great many calls that this was yet another slide towards an unprovoked war based on bad intelligence, and how terrible it was to see the United States going down that same route that we went to in Iraq in 2002, 2003. And my dear friends in Tehran did their best to prove Trump right by the attacks off Fujairah and the attacks on the Houthi attacks on the pipeline certainly made it seem quite plausible that there were risks. And then the mortaring of the the Green Zone near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad only magnified that view. And so suddenly the deployment of additional U.S. forces in the region, which was so widely decried a few days earlier, looked possibly justified, possibly even prudent. And I am impressed at the ability of the Iranians to shoot themselves in the foot.
If I could just add, my comments were not whether the maximum pressure would work or not. My comments were about what I would call, I guess, prudence and overreach, that there's probably kind of a sweet spot where you get the maximum benefits from economic pressure without incurring increased risk of pushing an adversary in a corner where they feel that they have no other option except maybe, the military option. So, and also, for deterrence to work, you also have to understand what the adversary's red lines are that will cause him to respond militarily and try to find ways to work around them, which is what Iran has been doing ever since, the birth of the Islamic Republic. So I would have just, argued that given that Iran has always said that if we can't export oil, nobody will export oil. They already said, that kind of going down to zero oil exports is kind of like their red line. So when we said, we're aiming for that and we're taking tangible steps to achieve that, is the additional bump you get from going down from, down to, from a million barrels to a few 100,000 barrels, or, is it worth the additional risk that you incur by doing that, potentially? And in order to make the policy sustainable domestically, you have to, consider that. But I think also the administration has a timeline, because I think their concern is they want to accomplish this on their watch because they don't know what might follow them after the next election. It might be another Trump administration, or it might be a Democrat. So you got to get it done now, and I think that kind of pushes them, to a maximalist kind of version of maximum pressure. But there are ways of doing it which perhaps, could kind of hit the sweet spot without, creating a elevated potential for military conflict, I guess is what I'm trying to say, hopefully.
Could we have someone on the other side of the room, please?
Middle East Institute. Let's assume now that deterrence fails. Would the panel want to speculate on what that means? What is escalation here look like? We've said a lot of things that we don't want to see, and that is, for example, a land conflict. But then what are we looking at? Because so all of the discussion has been what happens short of that.
Well, if I may start the comments. We at the Washington Institute a few years ago gave our book prize to a book entitled The Twilight Wars, which argued that the United States and Iran have been at war at that time for 35 years, now for 40 years. But the war has been conducted in the twilight. Something like Stuxnet, which after all was done by President Obama, was not an act of friendship. And that the way in which the two parties seem to prefer going after each other is indeed in the shadows, ambiguously, using proxies where possible. And I think that would continue to be their preference even as deterrence failed. So no matter how much deterrence failed, I would say that each of the two parties would do their darndest to see that any confrontations between them be of that character, and neither party is interested in a major head-on war. And that would be, I think, Iran had, shall we say, less than pleasant experiences with its major war with the Iraqis. And the United States had less than pleasant experiences with its war in Iraq. So it would get a lot hotter. We'd read about a lot more things in the newspapers and see them on television. But I think both sides would try and send messages to each other more privately than publicly.
I'll just add to that. First of all, deterrence has failed for both sides. I mean, because we crossed Iran's red lines by deciding not to reissue the waivers, saying we're going to go for zero. And they said, if you go for zero, then, that's our red line. And we did it. We crossed it. And then they, as Barbara said, when National Security Advisor Bolton said, made his comments, they then proceeded to cross his red line. So deterrence has failed for both parties. And I would argue, actually, the Supreme Leader says all the time, as we've heard by some of the other speakers, that we are already at war with the United States. So the problem is Americans have certain kind of preconceptions about war is large-scale conventional conflict, it's invasions of countries and the like. Well, as Patrick said, we've been involved in a kind of a low-intensity conflict that has waxed and waned with Iran. We've had embassies bombed. We've had military barracks bombed, and it didn't necessarily lead to dramatic escalation. So I think there is a potential for escalation. But again, the preferred way of war of Iran is to keep things, kind of within a certain threshold. And I hope, in pursuing our policy vis-a-vis Iran, that we also kind of look, act that way. And that, I think, again, as I've said before, and Admiral Miller, had, kind of mentioned, we had this kind of, reasonably hot engagement with Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, during the reflagging operation, and yet it didn't spread onto the land, really. So, we've been very good at containing our conflict, and let's hope we, can continue to be able to do that, moving forward. But again, if we choose to escalate otherwise, you can make unwise decisions that could lead to both either broadening of the conflict or intensification of the conflict. But again, I think that's probably not the way it goes to kind of a general war, which is the way kind of it's been presented in the media by some people.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just say that the difference between now and 31 years ago is that Iran has this whole suite of proxies and asymmetrical tools that it feels pretty confident of being able to use effectively against us. And as both Mike and Admiral Miller have touched upon, have largely perceived us not being willing to go up the escalatory ladder, and so they often escalate. So, do they control whether the Houthis decide to take some more pot shots? I've always found the arming of the Houthis to be one of the more reckless maneuvers by Iran, in the sense that, they're not a point-and-shoot operation. They have taken shots at shipping and at Saudi targets when we've had reason to think the Iranians had not goosed them to do so. And, it's only a matter of time before there's a major civilian casualty in Saudi Arabia. And then what will be the response of the Saudis? What will the Saudis ask the U.S. to do? And I don't think the Iranians calculate that carefully enough.
So let me put a little finer point on that. What we've seen just in the last, let's say, 24 months or so, from malign, what we would describe, or I would describe as malign Iranian behavior, with the Houthis in the Bab al-Mandeb Strait in the southern part of the Red Sea. It's support for anti-ship cruise missile activity. It's support for mining activity. It's support for unmanned ships or unmanned attacks on surface ships by small boats. So it's some fairly significant activity that affects a strait that supports about 3.5 to 5 million barrels of oil shipment each day. What we potentially see in the Strait of Hormuz is another 20% of the world's oil shipment, where they're not going to mine the Strait of Hormuz, but if they want to start mining, and they want to go back to doing that, and that's a very difficult activity to attribute to them. They can do that, and it's asymmetric activity. So we're not going to see, to the point that both Mike and Ambassador Leaf made, we're not going to see warlike activity break out between the United States and Iran. I don't think, but we'll potentially see more asymmetric activity from the Iranians, and activity that's difficult to attribute, and activity that is destabilizing in the region.
Please. Right here. Right, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Jeff Selden with VOA. While we've been here, both the White House and the Pentagon have confirmed that another 1,500 troops are going to be sent to the Middle East, not Iraq or Syria, but to the Middle East as force protection measures, including a Patriot battery. The Pentagon's also blamed Iran and the IRGC for the attacks on the tankers. With this latest move to send more to the Middle East, send more ISR, send the additional troops to Patriot batteries, what message is that going to send to Iran? How is Iran going to respond? Is it just going to be asymmetric, or are they going to do something more publicly? Also, one of the things that a lot of the people who support the president will say is that you have to separate some of the rhetoric from the administration's policies. You hear this a lot about Russia, and that the policies are often very, very good. And don't pay as much attention to the rhetoric. The policies will get things done the way the U.S. needs to have them done. Are the Iranians capable of viewing the communications in that way? And if not, what's the next step? Is there a way for U.S. diplomats and others to get around that?
So I don't think, this issue of the announcement today of 1,500 troops, I think that goes into the, on the side of the ledger of, very measured, very calibrated pieces being moved forward by the administration. This is not escalation, and I don't think the Iranians will necessarily react as such to this. The larger point to go back to for me is whether they really understand how that rhetoric matches what these steps are doing, are supposed to represent, and I would include in that the decision to go to order departure or evacuate a significant number of personnel from Baghdad and Erbil, which was a measure we didn't do at the height of the threat to Baghdad and Erbil in 2014, 2015 by ISIS. We had some shifting of personnel that was very carefully done with a lot of public messaging to the Iraqi government and to, in all directions to signal what we were doing and why we were doing it. That didn't happen when we evacuated. We simply did a standard sort of notification that we're doing it against these threats, etc. But the problem with such a move is it can also signal that we're getting people out of the way because we're going to do something kinetic. Again, that's not what I thought. I read it for what it was, although I regretted that it wasn't messaged comprehensively. But the Iranians can read that that way, and they can look at, and I fear they do look at all of this this discourse, not just the president and where he is versus what Bolton's statement says, but also what the Hill is saying. And again, this is where risk comes into play. They can assume that he has no stomach for any sort of actual military move. So they have lots of room, lots of space to play, that he's got too much congressional pressure on his back. And so, yes, they've got a fairly wide spectrum in which to play. That's where I see the danger.
By the way, I find it amusing when Iranians complain about the rhetoric that the United States, the Trump administration, has been using about Iran, and this is coming from an Iranian government which has for years organized chants of death to America and burning of American flags and walking over American flags. So you want to talk about lack of respect? We now have a president, we have a political temper in this country which seems to enjoy the kind of insults that have long been directed against the United States to direct them against other countries. And I think it's unfortunate. I'd rather have seen everybody ratcheting down their rhetoric. But I certainly don't think that those who have spent 40 years mastering the rhetoric of insult and belittlement are in any position to complain about it when it's directed against them.
Thanks very much. Mike Kraft, counterterrorism specialist. I have a question for Admiral Miller, sort of a hypothetical nitty-gritty. But could you describe the sort of command control structure? Say you have a scenario of Iranian small boats make a threatening attack against an American naval ship, and the commander decides he's got to open fire. And so that maybe some boats are sunk or some damage to the American ship. So at what level is the command and control structure able to keep it from escalating further, especially if we don't have direct communications with the Iranians on this? There's other scenarios too, like an attack on their coal or something of that sort. Could you kind of describe if there's any sort of safety checks arranged there?
Well, I think the overall concern that you're getting after is if there's some sort of a tactical action in the maritime environment, if you will, between the U.S. and the IRGC, it's how do we deal with that and keep it from escalating into becoming something bigger? How do we talk to the Iranians? And the point I tried to make in my remarks, and maybe I didn't quite get after it, is we don't have the methods in place to properly handle that. So, we have agreements to this day. We established them during the Cold War with the Soviets, so we have them to this day with the Russians. We have agreements with the Chinese, where if something happens between our forces, we have a way to deal with them, and to discuss things before things get out of hand. We don't have that with the Iranians, and we've made overtures, as I mentioned, to develop a hotline to be able to discuss them. But when I was the Fifth Fleet commander, I had no way and never did have any communications with who would be considered my counterpart in Iran. And so there's a difficulty there, and the same is true today at the diplomatic level. So if you go back to, there's 2 points I want to make here very quickly. If you go back to when our riverine craft were seized in the vicinity of Farsi Island in January of 2016, the reason that situation was resolved so quickly was because we were on the cusp of having the JCPOA agreement, and it was the best relations we had in the entire time we've ever had with the Iranians since the revolution. And so the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of Iran were able to communicate directly almost instantly because they had been communicating directly, and it was literally a day or two before the agreement was going to be signed. That communication channel no longer exists. And so if that similar situation happened today, how we would deal with that diplomatically, diplomat to diplomat or military to military, it would be much different and I think much more difficult. That's unfortunate. But the other point that I should make, that's an important point, is that we're out and about in the Gulf every day, the United States Navy, coalition navies, Iranians, Iranian fishermen, and there are search and rescue efforts that happen all of the time because that's just the nature of being at sea. And so there are rescues that happen all the time. There are rescue coordination efforts that happen between the United States Navy, coalition navies, Gulf navies, from Saudis, Emiratis, and Iranians that are coordinated efforts that are all about safety of life at sea. So there are opportunities for cooperation that take place, that happen every day, and they don't end up in the news. But when there are mariners in distress at sea in the Gulf, somebody, and it doesn't matter what flag they're flying, will come and rescue them. So there are ways to make this work a little bit better. There are opportunities for cooperation, and there are actually organizations that search and rescue organizations that exist on both sides of the Gulf that cooperate every day. So there's some hope.
Well, on that optimistic note, where there's some hope, I would like you to join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for coming.